The evening of March 8th, 1957, was cold in Harlem, with temperatures dropping to 38 degrees as the sun set around 6:15 and darkness settled over the neighborhood's streets and buildings. By 7:30, Lenox Avenue between 132nd and 133rd Streets was busy with Friday evening activity as residents finished work, stopped at shops and markets, and gathered at restaurants and clubs that served dinner and provided entertainment. The sidewalks were crowded with people wearing heavy coats and hats against the cold, their breath visible in the air as they moved between the warm interiors of buildings and the chilly March evening outside. Costello's restaurant occupied the ground floor of a four-story brick building on the east side of Lenox Avenue near 132nd Street, and the restaurant had opened in 1952 and had been named by its owner, Marcus Hendricks, a black businessman who had operated various establishments in Harlem for 20 years. Hendricks had named the restaurant Costello's as a gesture of respect toward Frank Costello, the Italian Mafia boss who controlled significant criminal operations in New York and who maintained cooperative relationships with Harlem's black criminal organizations, including Bumpy Johnson's operations. The name signaled that the restaurant was neutral territory, where both black and Italian figures could meet without territorial concerns, and the establishment had developed a reputation as a place where business could be conducted safely across racial and organizational lines. Costello's restaurant was a substantial establishment with seating for approximately 80 customers at tables and booths, arranged throughout the main dining room and in a smaller private dining area in the back. The restaurant served both traditional soul food, popular in Harlem, and Italian dishes that appealed to customers from downtown and from Italian neighborhoods. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, employing 6 cooks and assistants during busy evening hours. The restaurant's decor was simple but well-maintained, with white tablecloths, dark wood furniture, and framed photographs of prominent Harlem figures and Italian-American entertainers on the walls. Marcus Hendricks arrived at Costello's restaurant at approximately 5:45 on the evening of March 8th to oversee dinner preparations and to ensure the establishment was ready for the Friday evening crowd that typically filled the restaurant by 7:30. Hendricks was 62 years old, a careful businessman who maintained detailed control over his restaurant's operations and who prided himself on providing consistent quality and reliable service. Hendricks had built relationships throughout Harlem's business and criminal communities over his 2 decades of operating various establishments, and he understood that success required respecting both formal business practices and informal power structures that governed Harlem's economic life. Hendricks entered the restaurant through the front door and walked through the dining room toward the kitchen to check on food preparation. As Hendricks passed through the dining area, he noticed that several tables near the back wall appeared to have been moved slightly from their usual positions. Hendricks was particular about table arrangement and could immediately recognize when furniture had been displaced, even by small amounts. Hendricks walked to the back wall and examined the tables more closely, noticing that the table furthest from the kitchen had been pulled approximately 8 inches away from the wall. Hendricks bent down to look beneath the table to see if something had fallen that might explain why the table had been moved. As Hendricks looked under the table, he saw a wooden box approximately 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 6 inches tall, positioned against the wall behind where the table normally stood. The box was crudely constructed from rough pine boards and appeared to have been recently placed there, as there was no dust on its surfaces, and the floor around it showed marks suggesting recent movement. Hendricks did not immediately recognize the box as dangerous, thinking perhaps it was supplies that had been temporarily stored in the wrong location. Hendricks stood and walked to the kitchen to ask the staff if anyone had placed a box in the dining room. The evening manager, Thomas Chen, and the head cook, William Morrison, both stated they had not placed any boxes in the dining area and did not know what Hendricks was describing. Hendricks returned to the back wall with Chen and Morrison to examine the box together. When the three men looked at the box more carefully, Morrison noticed that thin wires emerged from the top of the box and disappeared into a small hole drilled in the wall behind it. Morrison had served in World War II and had received training in recognizing explosive devices during his military service. Morrison immediately told Hendricks and Chen that the box resembled explosive devices Morrison had seen during the war, and that they should evacuate the restaurant immediately and contact authorities. Hendricks, Chen, and Morrison ordered all restaurant staff to leave the building immediately through the back exit. The 6 kitchen workers, 3 servers, and 2 cleaning staff evacuated within minutes. Hendricks locked the restaurant's front door and placed a closed sign in the window, and then joined the other staff members in the alley behind the building. Hendricks told Chen and Morrison that he needed to contact someone before calling police, explaining that if the box truly contained explosives, the situation involved more than simple criminal activity and required understanding who had placed the device and why. Hendricks walked 2 blocks to a payphone and called a number connected to Bumpy Johnson's organization. Hendricks spoke with Marcus Williams, one of Johnson's senior associates, and explained that a suspicious box with wires had been found at Costello's restaurant, and that the box appeared to be an explosive device. Hendricks stated that he had evacuated the restaurant and that he was seeking guidance on how to proceed before involving police. But Williams told Hendricks to remain away from the restaurant and stated that someone would arrive within 20 minutes to examine the situation. Williams immediately contacted Johnson, who was at his apartment on West 147th Street. Williams explained the situation at Costello's restaurant, described Hendricks's discovery of the box, and noted Morrison's assessment that the device appeared to be explosives. Johnson listened carefully to Williams' account and asked several questions about when Hendricks had last been in the restaurant before finding the box, who had access to the building, and whether anything else appeared disturbed. After Williams answered these questions, Johnson stated he would go to Costello's restaurant immediately and instructed Williams to meet him there. Johnson arrived at Costello's restaurant at approximately 6:30, accompanied by Williams and 2 other associates, Samuel Foster and Raymond Carter. Hendricks was waiting in the alley behind the restaurant and led Johnson and his associates through the back entrance into the kitchen and then into the dining room. Hendricks showed Johnson the table that had been moved and pointed to the box positioned against the wall behind it. Johnson examined the box carefully from a distance of several feet without touching it or moving the table. Johnson observed the wires emerging from the top of the box and disappearing into the wall, noted the crude construction of the box from fresh pine boards, and observed that the box had no visible markings or labels. After approximately 5 minutes of careful observation, Johnson stepped back and spoke quietly with Williams, Foster, and Carter. Johnson recognized immediately that the device presented multiple layers of strategic problems beyond the immediate physical danger. The placement of explosives at Costello's restaurant was not a simple act of vandalism or random violence. The restaurant's name and its reputation as neutral meeting ground between Black and Italian organizations meant that an explosion there would be interpreted as an attack with specific meaning. If the bomb detonated and killed customers or destroyed the restaurant, the incident would create immediate questions about who was responsible and why, potentially destabilizing the careful arrangements that had maintained peace between Johnson's organization and the Italian Mafia for more than 20 years. Johnson understood that multiple actors could benefit from such destabilization. Rival factions within Italian Mafia organizations who opposed the arrangement, giving Johnson control over Harlem, might plant a bomb at Costello's restaurant, hoping to create conflict that would justify Italian Mafia intervention in Harlem. Younger members of Johnson's own organization who wanted to challenge Italian Mafia influence might plant a bomb, hoping to provoke Johnson into breaking his agreements. Outside criminal organizations seeking to enter Harlem's markets might create chaos, hoping to exploit the resulting disorder. Law enforcement agencies seeking to disrupt organized crime might plant evidence, hoping to provoke internal conflicts. Johnson recognized that responding to this situation required understanding who had placed the bomb and what outcome they sought, not merely removing the immediate threat. The device itself was a message and a provocation designed to trigger specific responses. Johnson needed to prevent the bomb from detonating while simultaneously investigating who had placed it and why, gathering evidence that would allow him to respond strategically rather than reactively. Johnson instructed Williams to contact the New York Police Department's bomb squad and report that a suspicious device had been found at Costello's restaurant. Johnson emphasized that Williams should request that bomb squad personnel examine the device immediately, but should not provide details about who had discovered it or who had called for assistance. Williams made the call from a payphone 2 blocks away, reporting the suspicious device anonymously and providing the restaurant's address. While Williams contacted police, Johnson examined the restaurant systematically to understand how the device had been placed and when. Johnson questioned Hendricks about the restaurant's schedule, learning that Costello's had been closed the previous day, Thursday, March 7th, for routine maintenance and cleaning. Hendricks had locked the restaurant at approximately 7 in the evening on March 7th after cleaning staff finished their work. Hendricks had not returned to the restaurant until arriving at 5:45 on March 8th to prepare for Friday evening service. Johnson examined the restaurant's doors and windows to determine how someone had gained entry between Thursday evening and Friday afternoon. The front door showed no signs of forced entry and remained properly locked when Hendricks arrived. The back door also appeared secure with no damage to the lock or frame. Johnson examined the windows and found that one window in the private dining area at the back of the restaurant had been opened from outside by prying the frame slightly, creating enough space to release the interior latch. Someone with knowledge of the building's layout and some basic tools could have entered through this window without creating obvious damage. Johnson instructed Foster and Carter to search the restaurant thoroughly for any other items that might have been left by whoever placed the bomb. The 2 men examined every room carefully, looking under tables, in storage areas, in the kitchen, and in the bathrooms. After approximately 20 minutes of searching, Carter found a small piece of paper wedged between two bottles behind the bar. The paper appeared to be part of a receipt or invoice with partial text visible reading Supply Co. and Brooklyn. Johnson examined the paper fragment carefully. The text and printing suggested it came from a commercial business document, possibly a receipt from a supplier. The mention of Brooklyn was significant because it indicated possible connections to Italian Mafia operations based in Brooklyn, which were controlled by different families than those who maintained the arrangement with Johnson in Harlem. At approximately 7:15, two New York Police Department bomb squad vehicles arrived at Costello's restaurant. 4 officers entered the building and examined the device. After approximately 15 minutes of careful examination, the senior bomb squad officer confirmed that the box contained approximately 3 pounds of dynamite connected to a simple timer mechanism set to detonate at 8 o'clock that evening, approximately 45 minutes from when police had arrived. The officers carefully disabled the timer mechanism, removed the dynamite, and secured the device for further examination. After the bomb squad officers removed the explosives and departed, Johnson returned to the restaurant with Williams, Foster, and Carter. Johnson examined the location where the bomb had been placed and the window that had been pried open. Johnson recognized that the timing of the device, set to explode at 8 o'clock on Friday evening when the restaurant would typically be filled with customers, indicated that whoever placed it intended to cause maximum casualties and to create a major incident that would receive significant attention. Johnson understood that preventing the bombing from achieving its strategic purpose required more than simply having disabled the device. If word spread throughout Harlem and throughout New York's criminal organizations that a bomb had been planted at Costello's restaurant, the incident would still create fear, suspicion, and pressure for violent response, even though no explosion had occurred. Johnson needed to control information about the incident while simultaneously investigating who was responsible and what they sought to accomplish. Over the following hours, Johnson developed a comprehensive strategy to understand and respond to the bombing attempt. The strategy had 4 integrated components: investigating who had planted the device and why, controlling information about the incident to prevent premature reactions, building a coalition to manage the situation diplomatically, and demonstrating capability without triggering the war that someone had hoped to provoke. The first component was systematic investigation to identify who had placed the bomb. Johnson enlisted multiple people to gather information through different channels. Williams contacted sources in law enforcement to learn if police had any information about who might have reported the device anonymously or who might have been seen near Costello's restaurant on Thursday evening or Friday morning. Foster spoke with residents and business owners near the restaurant to ask if anyone had observed unusual activity around the building during the previous 24 hours. Carter examined criminal networks to identify who might have access to dynamite and timer mechanisms, and who might have motivation to destabilize the arrangement between Johnson's organization and the Italian Mafia. Johnson also asked Hendricks to examine the restaurant's supplier records and recent deliveries to determine if anyone had made deliveries or service calls during the week that might have provided opportunity to case the building's layout and security. Hendricks reviewed invoices and receipts from the previous week and found that all deliveries and service calls had been from established vendors that the restaurant had used for years. The investigation produced several significant leads over the following 48 hours. Williams learned from police contacts that the bomb had been constructed using commercial dynamite that could have been obtained from construction sites or mining operations, but that showed no unique markings that would identify its source. The timer mechanism was simple and could have been assembled by anyone with basic knowledge of electrical circuits. Foster learned from residents near the restaurant that a delivery truck bearing the name of a Brooklyn supply company had been parked near Costello's restaurant on Thursday evening around 8 o'clock, approximately 1 hour after Hendricks had locked the building. 2 witnesses remembered the truck because it was unusual to see commercial deliveries at that hour. Carter learned that a small crew of Italian men from Brooklyn had been asking questions in certain Harlem establishments during the previous week about the layout of Costello's restaurant and about typical customer patterns on Friday evenings. Johnson compiled this information and recognized a pattern suggesting that a Brooklyn-based Italian Mafia faction had likely planted the bomb. The use of Brooklyn-based supply companies, the presence of Brooklyn Italians gathering information about the restaurant, and the paper fragment mentioning Brooklyn all pointed to involvement of organizations operating outside Manhattan. Johnson understood that Brooklyn Mafia factions were controlled by different families than those Johnson dealt with in Manhattan, and that some Brooklyn factions had opposed the arrangement, giving Johnson control over Harlem. The second component of Johnson's strategy was controlling information about the bombing attempt to prevent premature reactions that would serve the interests of whoever had planted the device. Johnson instructed everyone who knew about the incident, Hendricks and his staff, Johnson's associates, the residents who had seen the truck, to avoid discussing what had happened. Johnson explained that spreading news of the bombing would create exactly the panic and suspicion that the bombers wanted, potentially triggering violent responses before the situation was fully understood. Johnson contacted police officials through intermediaries and requested that the bomb squad's response not be publicized and that reports about the incident be handled discreetly. Johnson's political connections in Harlem included relationships with police commanders who understood that managing organized crime sometimes required quiet resolution of incidents rather than public scandals. Police officials agreed to classify the bomb squad response as routine investigation of a suspicious package and agreed not to release information to media. Johnson also contacted Marcus Hendricks and arranged for Costello's restaurant to remain closed for several days, with Hendricks explaining to customers and suppliers that the restaurant needed emergency repairs to plumbing systems. This explanation avoided raising questions about security concerns while preventing customers from gathering at a location that might still be targeted. The third component was building a coalition to manage the situation diplomatically rather than through immediate retaliation. Johnson understood that if Brooklyn Mafia factions had planted the bomb, hoping to provoke war between Johnson's organization and Manhattan Mafia families, the effective response was to demonstrate unity between Johnson and his Manhattan partners rather than allowing the provocation to succeed. Johnson contacted Frank Costello, the Italian Mafia boss who controlled significant operations in Manhattan and who had maintained the arrangement with Johnson since Lucky Luciano's imprisonment. Johnson arranged a meeting with Costello at a private location in Midtown Manhattan for the evening of March 10th, 2 days after the bomb had been discovered. At this meeting, Johnson presented the evidence his investigation had gathered: the Brooklyn Supply Company receipt, witness accounts of Brooklyn Italian men gathering information about the restaurant, the delivery truck from Brooklyn, and the timing suggesting an attempt to create a major incident. Johnson explained to Costello that the bomb appeared designed to accomplish two objectives: killing customers at a restaurant named in Costello's honor and creating suspicion between Johnson's organization and Manhattan Mafia families by making each suspect the other of betrayal. Johnson emphasized that preventing the bomb from detonating had removed the immediate threat, but that addressing who had planted it required coordinated response between Johnson's organization and Costello's organization to demonstrate that their arrangement remained strong. Costello understood Johnson's analysis and recognized that Brooklyn factions had likely acted without approval from the commission that governed Mafia operations. Costello stated that he would investigate which Brooklyn family had been responsible and would address the situation through proper channels. Costello emphasized that the arrangement with Johnson remained valuable and that unauthorized actions by Brooklyn factions would not be tolerated. Johnson also contacted Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who represented Harlem in the United States House of Representatives, to inform Powell that a serious incident had been prevented and that Johnson had evidence suggesting outside agitators had attempted to destabilize Harlem. Johnson asked Powell to communicate to federal law enforcement agencies that Harlem's leadership was managing the situation and that outside intervention was not necessary. Powell agreed to make these communications, understanding that preventing federal agencies from launching investigations would allow the situation to be resolved through established relationships rather than through prosecutions that might expose the entire structure of cooperation between Black and Italian organizations. The fourth component was demonstrating capability and resolve to deter future attacks while avoiding the open warfare that the bombing had been designed to provoke. Johnson recognized that simply identifying who had planted the bomb was insufficient. There needed to be visible consequences that would establish that attacking Costello's restaurant or attempting to destabilize Harlem carried severe costs. Johnson coordinated with Costello to identify the specific Brooklyn Mafia crew that had planned and executed the bombing. Costello's investigation determined that a crew led by a capo named Vincent Romano had planted the bomb without authorization from Romano's family leadership. Romano had opposed the arrangement giving Johnson control over Harlem and had acted independently, hoping to create conflict that would justify Brooklyn families asserting more direct control over Harlem's lucrative rackets. Costello arranged for Romano to be summoned to a commission meeting in mid-March, where he was confronted with evidence of the unauthorized bombing. Romano was forced to acknowledge his actions and was ordered to pay substantial financial penalties to both Johnson's organization and to the families whose interests had been jeopardized by his reckless actions. Romano was also demoted within his own organization and was prohibited from conducting any operations in Harlem or Manhattan. Johnson ensured that information about Romano's punishment spread throughout both Italian and Black criminal networks in New York. The message was clear: unauthorized attacks on Harlem's neutral establishments would be identified, those responsible would face severe consequences from their own leadership, and the arrangement between Johnson and Manhattan Mafia families was strong enough to coordinate effective responses to outside threats. Johnson also directed his organization to increase security at key Harlem establishments and to maintain heightened surveillance for several months to identify any additional threats. This security enhancement served both practical purposes of preventing future attacks and symbolic purposes of demonstrating that Johnson's organization remained vigilant and capable. The visible outcome of Johnson's comprehensive strategy became apparent over the following weeks. Costello's restaurant reopened on March 18th, 10 days after the bomb had been discovered. The reopening was attended by prominent figures from both Black and Italian communities, symbolically demonstrating that the establishment remained neutral ground and that the attempt to destabilize it had failed. No public announcement was made about the bombing attempt or about how it had been prevented, allowing the incident to be resolved without the publicity that would have created pressure for violent escalation. Vincent Romano's punishment became known throughout New York's criminal networks without any public documentation or official acknowledgement. The story that circulated, Romano had acted without authorization, had been caught, and had faced severe consequences from his own organization, served as powerful deterrent to others who might consider similar provocations. Frank Costello's willingness to investigate and punish Romano demonstrated to other Mafia families that the arrangement with Johnson was protected by the most powerful Italian boss in New York, and that violations would not be tolerated. This reinforcement of the arrangement's legitimacy strengthened Johnson's position and made future challenges less likely. The investigation itself demonstrated Johnson's organizational capacity in ways that prevented future threats more effectively than violence would have. Johnson had identified who planted the bomb within 48 hours through systematic information gathering. Johnson had prevented the device from achieving its strategic purpose by controlling information and preventing premature reactions. Johnson had built coalition support across racial and organizational lines to address the threat diplomatically. Johnson had ensured appropriate consequences for those responsible without triggering the war they had hoped to provoke. The broader significance of the incident related to how it illustrated principles about preventing violence through intelligence and diplomacy rather than through superior firepower. Someone had planted 3 pounds of dynamite in a crowded restaurant, hoping to kill dozens of people and to start a war. Johnson had prevented both outcomes through patient investigation, strategic information control, coalition building, and coordinated diplomatic response with former adversaries turned partners. The legacy of the incident persisted in several ways. A Costello's restaurant continued operating successfully until 1966, serving as neutral meeting ground where business could be conducted across organizational and racial lines. The restaurant's continued success demonstrated that attempts to destabilize such institutions through violence would fail when leadership responded strategically rather than reactively. The arrangement between Johnson's organization and Manhattan Mafia families continued without serious challenge until Johnson's death in 1968. The bomb incident and its resolution established precedent that unauthorized attacks on Harlem would trigger coordinated responses from both Black and Italian organizations, creating powerful deterrent effects that prevented similar provocations. The relationship between Johnson and Frank Costello was strengthened by the incident, as both men recognized that coordinating their response to outside threats served their mutual interests. This strengthened relationship provided stability that benefited both organizations' operations over the following decade. For historians and social scientists studying organized crime in mid-20th century New York, incidents like the Costello's restaurant bombing attempt illustrated how criminal organizations maintained order through mechanisms similar to those used by legitimate governments: intelligence gathering to identify threats, diplomatic negotiation to resolve conflicts, coordinated enforcement to punish violations, and strategic communication to deter future challenges. The incident also demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how violence serves organizational purposes. Johnson could have responded to discovering a bomb by launching immediate retaliation against Brooklyn Mafia operations, which would have created the open warfare that Romano had hoped to provoke. Instead, Johnson prevented the bombing from achieving its purpose by working with Costello to identify and punish those responsible through internal organizational processes that avoided public violence while delivering severe consequences. This approach reflected Johnson's long-standing principle that violence should serve strategic purposes rather than emotional ones. The point of power was not to demonstrate capability through constant fighting, but rather to prevent fighting by making potential adversaries recognize that challenges would be identified, addressed effectively, and punished appropriately. The bomb incident demonstrated this principle perfectly. Someone had attempted to start a war, and Johnson had prevented the war while ensuring severe consequences for those responsible. The calm resolution of the crisis, a bomb discovered, disaster prevented, culprits identified within days, punishment coordinated with former adversaries, restaurant reopening within weeks, arrangements strengthened rather than destabilized, illustrated how power operates through demonstrated competence rather than dramatic gestures. Johnson did not publicly announce that he had saved dozens of lives by finding a bomb. Johnson did not advertise that he had prevented a war. Johnson simply gathered information systematically, analyzed the situation strategically, built appropriate coalitions, and achieved outcomes that served his interests while avoiding the chaos that enemies had hoped to create. The story of what happened spread through criminal networks naturally as participants shared information and as the consequences for Romano became known. The narrative emphasized several key points. Someone had tried to attack Harlem's neutral ground. The attack had been discovered before it succeeded. Those responsible had been identified quickly. Severe punishment had been imposed through proper channels, and the incident had strengthened rather than weakened the arrangement between Black and Italian organizations. This narrative created lasting effects throughout New York's criminal ecosystem. Would-be challengers to Johnson's position recognized that attacking Harlem's institutions would trigger sophisticated responses involving multiple organizations working together. Brooklyn Mafia factions learned that unauthorized operations in Harlem would be exposed and would result in punishment from their own leadership. Law enforcement agencies observed that criminal organizations could manage serious incidents without creating public violence that would require aggressive intervention. For Marcus Hendricks and other Harlem business operators, the incident demonstrated that neutral establishments received protection from multiple organizations when threats emerged. Hendricks had called Johnson when he found the bomb. Johnson had prevented the explosion and identified those responsible. And Johnson had worked with Italian Mafia leadership to ensure appropriate punishment. The restaurant had reopened successfully and had continued operating profitably for nearly a decade. This successful resolution encouraged other business operators to maintain relationships with Johnson's organization, knowing that serious threats would be addressed effectively. For Frank Costello and other Italian Mafia leaders, the incident demonstrated that Johnson's organizational capacity was sufficiently sophisticated to merit genuine partnership rather than mere toleration. Johnson had gathered intelligence, analyzed complex situations, built coalitions, and coordinated responses in ways that protected mutual interests. This capability made Johnson a valuable ally rather than simply a subordinate paying tribute. The incident occurred during a period when Johnson was approximately 52 years old and had been controlling Harlem's rackets for more than 20 years. Johnson would continue operating successfully for another 11 years until his death in 1968. During those final 11 years, no serious challenges to Johnson's position emerged, partly because incidents like the Costello's restaurant bombing had established that challenging Johnson required capabilities that few organizations possessed. The broader lessons from the incident related to how leadership prevents disasters rather than merely responding to them. Less sophisticated leaders might have ignored the suspicious box Hendricks found, allowing the bomb to detonate and kill dozens. Or they might have responded to discovering the bomb by launching immediate retaliation without investigating who was actually responsible. Either response would have served the interests of those who planted the device by creating chaos and violence. Johnson's response, immediate evacuation to protect lives, careful investigation to identify culprits, information control to prevent premature reactions, coalition building to address the threat diplomatically, and coordinated punishment through proper channels, prevented the disaster while establishing precedents that prevented similar incidents in the future. This prevention was far more valuable than dramatic responses after catastrophes occurred. The quiet nature of the resolution also reflected Johnson's understanding that real power does not require constant advertisement. Costello's restaurant reopened without fanfare. Romano's punishment happened through internal organizational processes without public trials or newspaper coverage. The strengthened arrangement between Johnson and Costello continued operating without announcements or publicity. The deterrent effects on potential challengers emerged naturally as information spread through networks rather than through dramatic public statements. This quiet effectiveness characterized Johnson's entire approach to power. Johnson had risen to control Harlem's rackets through intelligence and strategic thinking rather than through being the most violent or the most ruthless. Johnson had maintained that control for decades through building relationships, negotiating agreements, gathering information, and responding to challenges strategically rather than emotionally. The bomb incident exemplified these principles perfectly. In the years after Johnson's death, as new generations of criminals emerged with different approaches, emphasizing violence and chaos over strategic intelligence, older Harlem residents who remembered Johnson's era would sometimes reference incidents like Costello's restaurant as examples of how leadership used to operate. These references emphasized that Johnson had prevented wars rather than won them, had saved lives rather than taken them when alternatives existed, and had built arrangements that benefited Harlem economically, even while involving criminal activities. The incident also illustrated fundamental tensions in organized crime between short-term gains from violence and long-term benefits from stability. Romano had seen potential short-term advantage in starting a war that might allow Brooklyn families to assert control over Harlem's rackets. But Costello and other established leaders recognized that the existing arrangement provided stable, predictable profits without the costs and risks of constant warfare. Johnson had built his entire position on providing this stability, and the bomb incident demonstrated that both Black and Italian organizations valued stability enough to coordinate their responses to threats against it. The sophisticated investigation that identified Romano within 48 hours of discovering the bomb reflected organizational capabilities that Johnson had developed over decades. The information networks that allowed Foster to learn about the Brooklyn delivery truck, and the police contacts that provided Williams with information about the device's construction, the criminal network sources that told Carter about Italian men gathering information. These capabilities existed because Johnson had invested systematically in building relationships and maintaining information flows throughout multiple communities and organizations. The diplomatic skill Johnson demonstrated in presenting evidence to Costello and securing coordinated response reflected decades of experience negotiating across racial and organizational boundaries in environments characterized by distrust and conflict. Johnson understood how to frame situations in ways that aligned his interests with those of potential partners, how to provide evidence that created obligation to respond, and how to structure consequences that served multiple parties' interests while addressing threats effectively. The incident stood as one example among many of how Johnson maintained power in Harlem through methods that emphasized intelligence, patience, and organization over violence and chaos. While Johnson certainly employed violence when necessary and had a reputation for being dangerous when crossed, his long-term success derived from preventing situations from requiring violence by addressing threats early through information gathering and by resolving conflicts through negotiation when possible. The calm ending to the Costello's restaurant incident, disaster prevented, culprits identified and punished, arrangements strengthened, business continuing profitably, represented the outcomes Johnson sought in all his operations. The point was not dramatic victories or memorable confrontations, but rather stable, profitable operations that benefited those who participated, and that discouraged challenges through demonstrated capability rather than constant fighting. This approach to power would not survive Johnson's death in 1968, as subsequent generations of criminals often lacked the relationships, intelligence networks, and diplomatic skills that had made Johnson's approach effective. The breakdown of stable arrangements after Johnson died revealed how dependent such systems were on particular individuals rather than on institutional structures that would persist without them. But during Johnson's lifetime, and the approach produced decades of relative stability and profitability that benefited multiple organizations and that prevented many potential disasters through early intervention and strategic response. The Costello's restaurant bombing attempt and its resolution became part of the larger story of how Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem through strategic intelligence rather than superior violence, through building coalitions rather than fighting alone, and through preventing wars rather than winning them. Whether the specific incident occurred exactly as described, or occurred in different form, or represented composite of multiple events, or existed primarily in collective memory, the story captured essential truths about how Johnson operated and why he succeeded where others failed.